You are now listening to Testimonies with Terry.
All right, guys, I am here with a very talented artist who has an eclectic sound. His latest album, Accidental Days, recently came out this past March. Chase Tremaine, welcome to the show, man.
Hi, thanks for having me, Terry.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, man. This is pretty cool. First time getting to chat, getting to meet each other. And I was just telling you before we push the record button that I've had Accidental Days on repeat over the last couple weeks. And we were also talking. You have a podcast too, Chase. What's your podcast called?
Well, I'm a staff writer for a music website called Jesus Freak Hideout. And about a year into writing for them, they tapped me to start a podcast for them. So that was about 5 years ago. We're approaching episode 200 later this year.
Wow.
About 180 in at this point. That is kind of a mixture of interviewing Christian artists and having topical, usually music-related conversations with other staff writers from the site.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. We were both talking about Rockfest Records and how we both interviewed Joe Rojas, Zana, and yeah, I think every musical artist I've had on the show so far has been very straightforward, like rock, metal, and with you, like I said, you got a very eclectic sound. I mean, you pull from all sorts of genres to really make your own, which I've loved, man. Like honestly, like I love, and so I'm excited to get to know you a little bit more, your story a little bit more, and let the listeners know about the latest album, Accidental Days. But I got to start off, man, in doing some research on you. Star Wars: The Last Jedi. So you have to be the only person that I've come across.
This podcast is derailed completely, and instead of an hour and a half about my testimony, just an hour and a half about The Last Jedi.
Right, man, you're probably the only person I know who's like a diehard fan of Last Jedi, and so I want to pick your brain. I'm a Star Wars fan. I'm not like a diehard fan, but I'll watch all the movies. My wife and I love The Mandalorian, but The Last Jedi was a very divisive movie in the fandom of Star Wars. So I got to know what's the love that you have for Last Jedi.
Sure. Well, it's funny, the division. I think the most important thing to remember about the division that it literally is like a split of people who absolutely hate it and people who really adore it. You know, and that's the side I'm on. And it becomes really easy, especially like online and with, you know, groups and algorithms and such, to only get one of those narratives. So I've worked pretty hard over the past, few years to maintain, a bridge and, branch across those two sides and not let something as silly as an opinion about a big, franchise blockbuster film, be anything that is actually like relationally divisive. But there are people who absolutely like it is almost like foundational to their identity to be just like really deeply upset about what that movie did and where they took, the characters, specifically Luke Skywalker, that is a hero to many people. I didn't come into the movie with quite that mentality. I grew up liking the Star Wars movies. I wasn't the type of person to watch them frequently, to keep going back to my original trilogy VHSs all the time. And like I think my like height as a Star Wars fan was probably like 1999 as a kid going to see Phantom Menace. It kind of peaked there and kind of went down. By the time Revenge of the Sith came out, I was just barely interested still. I think I went to see it like once in theaters and that was it, and didn't see it again for many, many years. So didn't have much care about the new trilogy. I thought Force Awakens was fine. I didn't like Rogue One. So I'm coming into Last Jedi not really stoked on the franchise or the trilogy at all. I will admit I went into it as a Rian Johnson fan. That specifically his movie The Brothers Bloom was a kind of a modern favorite of mine. So just really liking one of his movies, and even that, like, I didn't like Looper either, which was the big like blockbuster that he made
Yeah.
before The Last Jedi. So a lot of like kind of cautious, semi disinterest going into it, and admittedly didn't love it on my first time seeing it. That like opening night viewing of the movie, it was a great theater experience. I was definitely in one of the crowds that like loved it and freaked out over the big surprise and the reveals. There was lots of laughing and cheering and gasping and all that throughout that. So it was a really cool theater experience, but I walked out being like, I don't know if that was a good movie. It was very fun. It was very surprising. I don't know if it was good.
Sure.
And then I went back for a second viewing, and just had one of the most amazing emotional movie going experiences of my life. Cried like 6 times over the course of the movie, and had the closest thing I can say to an experience that matches what people describe seeing the original one in 1977 or seeing Empire back in 1980, of just this like transportative, like imagination bursting forth type. Like, I've never seen or experienced anything like this, and it brought forth just this like childlike glee and this overflow of emotion, and this thing that really like made my imagination kind of burst forth in a way that I found deeply moving and inspiring. And I think it's very easy to engage with art and media, as in kind of an escapist way that like our imagination just only goes as far as the product that we're seeing or hearing. And I found that this movie, especially as I just continued watching it over the past 5 or so years, just continued like pushing me further and inspiring me further, that it wasn't trying to be an end in itself, but rather was something that encouraged, like my mind and my heart and my thoughts to go further than what's simply on the film. So really beautiful experience overall. And I will say, like, as a film and as someone who has like studied film and tried making movies back in high school, I do think it is like a technical marvel and excellent in all like technical ways. I think the people who try to say that it is a objectively bad movie are the people who are trying to cover up how actually like unobjective and emotional their takes are, and how much their criticisms of the movie have to do with their personal relationship with the characters rather than their
Yeah.
like ability at thoughtful film criticism. Um, so again, we could derail this entire. If you ever wanted to do an episode about The Last Jedi, wouldn't make sense for this podcast at all. I would happily go down that course, but I guess I'll stop myself now from going further.
Yeah. Yeah, no, man, I appreciate your insight on that. I think that's art overall, right? Whether that's movies, music, TV shows. Some people love certain things. Some people really don't like certain things, and to each their own, right? Like
Yeah.
it's pretty subjective. There's no like standard of like this is good, this is bad. But I just thought that was interesting, because yeah, like I said, you're probably the only person I know who's really passionate about that movie, and I really wanted to get your take on that. I grew up a Power Rangers fan, and
Hey,
when
me
the
too.
movie rebooted, yeah, awesome, yeah, and when the movie rebooted in 2017, a lot of Power Rangers fans didn't like it because it was so different and everything. But I went into it not really knowing what to expect. I liked it. And so, yeah, everyone has different tastes. And behind me, if you guys are watching this on video, I plan on building like a set at some point, shelving with like little mementos from each guest. So I'm gonna have to get like a Porg Funko Pop or something to commemorate this interview
That
with
would be
you,
amazing.
Chase.
Actually, I have like all of the all of the Porg Funko Pops.
That's awesome.
Big. I have way too much Last Jedi memorabilia. It's kind of, I've had to like cut myself off, but it's also like I have so much at this point that it's hard to find anything else.
Right.
But I think I can get us like a decent segue here, that like I'm pretty convinced that I can make objective arguments about The Last Jedi's qualities as a movie. But as like, I said in my description, the most important thing for me is the subjective experience I had. Is I'm not here to like try to um say that anyone's subjective experience, of that movie making them angry or sad or confused is wrong. That's like what they actually experienced, even though I
Yeah.
also think it's an objectively good movie. And that's such a critical thing when we talk about like our faith testimonies. As like, when we
Right.
talk about like the gospel of Christ, when we talk about, his, you know, incarnation, his life, his resurrection, his reign today, like we are talking about objective facts. Like, and it's important to think of it as like something that is historically true and currently true. But, on a person to person level, that really only matters when it comes down to like our subjective interaction with those objective facts. And that's effectively what a testimony is. Like what is your subjective experience with, the God who was real, the God who was there. So that's me being a podcast host, coming trying to segue us.
No, I love that, man. And so yeah, let's get into it. I always like to start at the beginning with my guests. So Chase, take us back. Where did you grow up? What was family life like for you as you were growing up?
Sure, I am almost a PK. Um, for I'm sure probably most of the listeners know that stands for pastor's kid, kind of the term that's thrown all around. But my dad was never officially a pastor. He was just always trying to be one. His father, my grandfather, was a pastor. So there's a handful of masters of divinity degrees in my family, and ironically, uh, and I also I want to say off the top, um, throughout this entire story, there's a fair possibility that I will say a handful of deeply like sour and negative things about my father in terms of our past and kind of shortcomings from my vantage point of growing up. So I want to say off the top that, and maybe we'll get to this point later in the conversation, that his life has completely turned around, and he is an amazing father and extremely present and caring and I think godly, I would even say. So that's just a teaser for how things turn out. But growing up, very much like he was my idea of what I thought a good man was supposed to be because he was so deeply involved in church and was a hard worker. But in reality, my parents' marriage was dying. He was an absent father. He spent so long like working a full-time job and working overtime and volunteering at the church, trying to become a pastor while also having his career as a police officer. That like I had to juggle this weird dichotomy of like thinking of him as like this super ideal, like Christ-like man who loves the Lord, but he wasn't there at all. He was um, some of my few memories of him from my childhood are really sad ones of me like trying to see him for his birthday or something and just kind of like being ignored and things like that. So but I had my mom as a like not a deep believer, but definitely a steady one, and so had plenty of church community, plenty of um, upbringing in kind of a faithful Christian context, to the point where I do believe that God saved me probably somewhere around the age of 5 or 6. That's something that I doubted for a long time and am cynical enough to likely doubt in the lives of others, especially with the amount of people who fall away from the faith in their teenage years or once they get out of the house. But the the overarching theme that I see for my life is, the concept of the perseverance of the saints, or preferably one could say the preservation of the saints, that God keeps his believers and doesn't let his um, sons and daughters fall away. And that is something that I say, like, to God's credit and not to my credit. The fact that I've been a believer through all the ups and downs of life, the past, 25-ish years of, again, like, thinking 25 years is probably about right in terms of how long I've been a Christian. That, I truly believe I've been a saved person with the Holy Spirit inside of me for that long, because I can look back and see all the ways that God has kept me over the years.
That's awesome, man. How did that affect you with your relationship with your dad being what it was as you were growing up? It sounds like there was this deep longing and this desire to have a close relationship with dad, but for whatever reason, him being busy, him maybe prioritizing other things, you didn't have that. How did that affect you?
Well, I definitely didn't know it was affecting me at the time. That concept of you not knowing what you don't have, or um, you don't know what you don't know. And I just assumed for, so much of my life that I was in a good family and there was a healthy marriage, and that I had a good godly father, right? So it really wasn't until when I was in junior high, 7th and 8th grade, that my parents' marriage started falling apart, and there was this year-long uh, divorce process, from the initiation of it to the finalization of the legality and the contracts and everything. And that kind of went across my 7th and 8th grade years. That was kind of when I realized that, looking back, like, oh, I did not have, like, the good ideal father that I thought I had, and that I, spent so much of my childhood looking up to. And I think it caused me to have, confused ideas of what a good man is, what a good father is. Um, so I saw, like, knowledge as more important than kind of relational presence, and having the correct answers to things being more important than, you know care, and being, like, in the mud with someone, uh and always felt that I could come to him for advice and for the right answers. And I mean, really, like, there were plenty of times throughout, my life where I did go to him for the answers, and hung on to those for years, only to realize, like, no, like, don't think he was giving me the right stuff. I don't think he um knew what he thought he knew. And um some of those would be theological disagreements that he and I still share today. um it's like, he and I are absolutely, even though I do believe, he is a truly, like, godly and sanctified man who's, doing his best to follow and honor the Lord, I still personally think he's off on a lot of, like, like, theological levels. But it was even, like, to a worse degree, in my childhood, coming to him thinking that, like, whatever my dad said was correct. So if I ask him about, questions about heaven and hell, or um, deep things about, like, Romans 9 and like, predestination and stuff, that I'm gonna get something that is theologically accurate. And definitely was not in a household or in a church that helps people understand the breadth of theological discourse and church history, and the wide array of different thoughts that believers throughout history have had on different topics. So it's like, I just thought there was the correct answers, and that my dad would disperse those to me. and that was him being a good dad. And so it's like getting to this point where it's like, oh, he wasn't really there for me when it mattered and didn't really show me how to be a man. But also, in the one thing that I thought he did really well was also kind of like leading me astray spiritually and not giving me um truth. He thought he was, but you know, uh probably wasn't until like late high school, early college that I started really grappling with things that he had taught me growing up. And then there was even things of like, being like a post-pubescent, boy, and uh, growing up in a world of, um, you know, the sexual ethic changing and sexual deviancy becoming so easily accessible that really from both of my parents, I think coming from histories of their own brokenness, kind of passed down that brokenness to me. And like my I remember having like an 8th grade cafeteria conversation with my friends, um, telling them that I like went to my parents to ask for kind of advice and help with these issues of sexual sin and sexual discovery, and they just thought I was so insane that I would go and talk to my parents about this. And it's really sad to look back that I was like one of the few teenagers with the gall to actually go to my parents to discuss this topic, that it wasn't them coming to me. It was me going to them being like, hey, I think I'm sinning here. I think I'm getting into some bad stuff. Can you help? And they both just fumbled the ball and gave me awful advice and did not call sin, um, and did not give me the encouragement or support that could have really, really helped me out during that pivotal time in my life. And
Wow, man.
they've both like in more recent years realized, that they messed up and that they um, weren't, the parents that they should have been in that regard. And so there's been like personal reconciliation between me and my parents for the ways in which they messed up and did not take, those opportunities to be the parents that I needed. But, despite having that present reconciliation now, there's still the issue that, we can't change the past and the ways in which, my entire life has been far more troubled than it theoretically could have been, had, the conscience of a young boy, um, and like the tender soul of someone who was committing sins he knew was wrong, and his parents said, you're fine. If that had been stewarded more carefully, it could have been life-changing for me. So
For sure. For sure, man. There's a lot to unpack there. I want to go back just a
Sure.
little bit. Uh, just a little bit here. So first off, the divorce. You said you were like in middle school, 7th, 8th
Mhm.
grade when your parents got divorced. What was that like for you? I mean, you're 12, 13 years old at that point, always really knowing mom and dad together, and now they're splitting apart. How did you handle that? What did that look like for you as far as, did you split time between both? Were you primarily with mom or dad? Walk us through that.
Sure. I think the hardest part of it for me emotionally was when I saw it coming. I think it was actually probably a bit earlier, maybe 6th grade, um, where I just started to catch some of those like fights and, um, or like find my mom just like broken down crying and realizing like, oh, everything's not okay. Like, are y'all getting divorced? Is, what's happening here? Um, and so I think I, dealt with the emotions of it by myself before it became official, which sucks, but was helpful overall. That, once the divorce entered the official, processes, like at that point I was like, I understood it, I saw it coming, I'd kind of emotionally swallowed it, and so it became much more logistical at that point. And as far as children of divorce go, my brother and I had it extremely easy. I would say that the general experience of divorce that my brother and I had is very lucky, way above average, not nearly as harmful to us as it can be for so many kids. Which, for my brother, by the time it was finalized, he was out of high school, and he did some like traveling and touring. So he got to be out of it a little bit. But the general breakdown is that I stayed with my mom and my brother went with our dad. But the really cool thing, actually, two really cool things. One is that he just moved down the street. So splitting time between my parents was just a matter of a 2-minute walk. And the second thing that was really cool is that to this day, I actually don't know if the court had any specific orders on how much time to spend with which parent, or who had more custody or whatever. That they basically had a friendly handshake agreement to just let us spend as much time with either parent as we saw fit. And there's a certain extent to which the divorce was a wake-up call to my dad. Like, it was the first time in his life where he realized, like, oh dang, I've been messing up. I have not been the husband I should have been. I've not been the dad that I should have been. So it wasn't until the divorce that I actually got to start spending time with my dad on like a friend level and like hanging out with him. We started like putting every Monday night aside to watch 24 and do crossword puzzles together. Like that was our thing for like a year or two. And so I had this, my dad became this just one of my friends who lived in the neighborhood, kind of. It's like I had Mark a few houses down, Dylan a few houses down, and then, Timothy Tremaine up the street. And so that was really cool. And then things were okay with me and my mom for a while. I think the older I got, the more our relationship started to crack, because I definitely grew up as like a mama's boy, and I was very much like the obedient, like goody two shoes, never got grounded, super easy child, which was in stark contrast to my older brother, my only sibling, who was the trouble child that like none of the other parents wanted their kids hanging out with Taylor Tremaine because he would just get their kids into trouble. Um, like barely passing his classes, not going to college, getting to detention all the time, sneaking out at night. Like he was that kid. So I maintained a good relationship with my mom throughout my teenage years, and it was really the decision to stay home for college and to live at home and commute to a local college that those few years kind of broke us. But that's jumping ahead pretty far. So honestly, like again, like the divorce was a good experience, relatively speaking. That it really didn't become a bad thing until both of my parents rushed into very unhealthy new marriages. Um, my and that was like within like a year and a half, I think, of the marriage, of the
Oh,
divorce being
wow.
final, maybe even less.
Yeah.
That both of them were remarried. Um, my mom's remarriage actually like uprooted us an hour and a half away to a small town in East Texas. So spent a few months thinking like, okay, this is my new home. This is my new high school. This is where I need to make all of my friends. This is where I'm just like planting myself. Um, and I say 3 months because the marriage lasted that short. Um, that I hated the guy. He and I did not get along at all. Um, he was constantly forcing me to try to be like his kids, his super outdoorsy, chopping wood, shooting deer, kids. And I'm over here like a little sensitive, like I don't want to help with chores. I'm writing poems. So living on a ranch with this guy was just terrible. Um, and to my mom's credit, she was committed to making it work and dealing with the bad things, even though like he basically like stole money from her and it was a terrible situation. But she was, again, like she was putting her feet down and saying, you know what, like we'll make the money back, we'll figure things out, we'll get through this. And the straw that broke the camel's back for her was when her new husband admitted that he didn't like me. And it was like, oh, you
Wow.
don't like my son? Okay, well then we're out of here. We packed up and left in a single day. It was like I just like woke up one morning. She was like, "Hey, you're not going to school today." He didn't realize that we were leaving. He didn't realize that she was initiating a divorce. We just got a moving truck and we're out of there in a few hours. We became very efficient at moving that year. 4 different moves within 12 months. But my dad's remarriage was like a lot tougher, specifically for how long it lasted. That I think, again, both of them went into these new marriages wanting to learn from the past, wanting to do better, wanting to create something that would last and not lead to divorce again. And so, my dad really buckled in, and man, I think they were married for a solid 5 years or so. And again, like he was just like, I think he was miserable the entire time. I think very early on he realized that he made a mistake and married a freeloader who like didn't work a day the entire time they were married and just was spending his money and wasting her time, like just rearranging furniture every week and all this nonsense, and not being like kind to me at all. And there was a lot of drama with her kids, who like I was friends with, like we got along, but it still always turned into stuff. And the the marriage stayed together until my dad found evidence that she had been cheating on him, and that was what finally broke it for him, and gave him the kind of the mental freedom to leave it, which was something that I had been petitioning for a long time. And once they were finally divorced and my parents were both single, my brother and I attempted a handful of Parent Trap things to try to get them back together that always failed miserably. It's so ironic that like the Lindsay Lohan remake of The Parent Trap was like one of our favorite movies growing up, and my mom
Same here.
literally took me to the theaters like 7 times to see that, and then however many times you like the VHS played at our house during my childhood, and then it became like the blueprint for me and my brother to try to get our parents back together.
Right.
Good times.
Man, I can't imagine, especially being as young as you were at that time, seeing all this go around you. The word that comes to my mind is just or I guess the concept that comes to mind is love. And it sounds like, you were kind of the mama's boy. You went to your dad for answers, but it sounds like that emotional connection wasn't really there. And then they both get remarried. You did not like stepdad at all. Doesn't sound like you were a huge fan of stepmom either. And you mentioned, I think it was around this time as well, just some of the purity struggles that you were having. And in my mind, my therapist brain, that makes complete sense why that maybe became a struggle, just due to the lack of attachment, the lack of emotional affection or attention even. And you said that you went to your parents for questions and for advice on what to do with this, which I think is very impressive. Like you said, like most teenagers won't do that,
Yeah.
right? You know, the fact that you felt confident enough or bold enough or maybe even desperate enough to be like, hey, like I don't feel great about doing this. What advice do you have? You said that they kind of fumbled the bag with that. So to whatever extent you're comfortable with, man, what did that look like as far as the struggle with purity and how you've been able to battle it throughout your life?
Sure. Yeah, I was being very vague earlier because I just not sure what like the audience of this podcast is and didn't want to say anything not
Sure.
PG. So for anyone listening who needs to remove, a audience that isn't ready for PG-13 descriptions of the purity issues. I mean, it was like sixth grade that like neighbor friends introduced me to pornography, um and that was, I think, a secondary struggle for me, that like friends introduced me to that, but I discovered masturbation on my own in like a very like oddly natural and biological way, just a weird like self-discovery that um again it's just like it's biologically, it's instinctual, um
Yeah.
and it kind of took over my life. For those like 7th and 8th grade years, I became just really crazy about it, and kind of doing it um all the time, like whenever I could, wherever I could. And so I was like basically breaking the law as like a 13-year-old, like finding ways to like do it in public or to do it in school. And so it was really, really bad. And it's like I had spent, again, like I believed I was really a Christian. I believed, the Holy Spirit. I still believe, the Holy Spirit was in me, and that there was this pang in my conscience. Um, but like masturbation is just one of those weird things where it's like, for whatever reason, there are so many Christians who are afraid to call it sin, and afraid to say that like this is an issue of self control and lust and selfishness that needs to be submitted to the Lord, and to be um, removed from your life, in as much as possible. And there's like the concept of like nocturnal emissions, of being like this like biological thing that happens to kind of you know let loose, like what's built up over time, right? I never had those, and I think it's because like I never even had a chance for build up, because I was just like so crazy about it. And so like I knew I was deep. I was in deep, as again, like I wasn't even in high school yet. This was like 8th grade at this point. Um it just completely like warped me in my thinking and took over. Um and and I was like, at the same time, was like it was like 6th or 7th grade that after spending my entire life being very like high ideal in my like romantic desires, like I was never the kid who thought girls had cooties. I thought girls were amazing from like day one. Like I had passionate crushes in pre-K and kindergarten and first grade. Like I remember like who I was just madly in love with like every year of my life. Like childhood through high school. And I genuinely desired, like um I didn't want to kiss anyone until either my wedding day, or at least I knew that it was the person I was going to marry. Like those were my ideals, and I held on to that for the first 12 years of my life as like one of my greatest desires. And then like, 6th grade, in a game of truth or dare, through a whole bunch of peer pressure, ended up, you know, my first kiss was to a total stranger that I met that day, have never seen again, and don't remember her name. Like the exact opposite of my first kiss being with like the love of my life, and the spouse, soulmate, like however you want to put it. So so that like coincided with these purity issues, and all of a sudden it's like I don't like, my ideals are breaking down, and I'm starting to have like my first like school girlfriends, and trying to go on dates, and trying to sneak in opportunities to like make out with these other like 7th and 8th graders, which like I look back on it now being like, how terrible that people like that young are like giving themselves over to this. And and it was just this culturally normal thing that statistically is just moving increasingly younger. It's like now like completely prepubescent kids are being encouraged or culturally trained or whatever to into this behavior. It's increasingly sickening, and it's like I was both a perpetrator and victim of this cycle. And so like all these things kind of mesh together, and I was starting to want more from these girls I went to school with, and I just couldn't get my own desires out of my head at any time of day, and it was corrupting my spirituality, and I knew that. And I was a weird kid. Like I fasted on a regular basis as a 7th and 8th grader. Like spiritual fasts was like give up food for a day or for a week. Like I was trying. Like there was like a genuine desire to be holy and to pursue Christ, and it was just like it was like the sexual thing that was just tripping it up over and over again. um and yeah, so I came to my parents both like one at a time, and specifically just asked them on the topic of masturbation, like what is this? Is this sin? Um is it natural? Like what can I do to stop? Like and my mom's answer was super like, was like, it's just, yeah, every guy does it. Like didn't really like address it from like a spiritual standpoint at all. And then I went to my dad at the time, like not knowing at all that he had his own, like struggles with sexual sin. Um, he gave me like a, he basically said, um, to me as an 8th grader that like, as long as you're not still doing it a bunch by the time you get to college, I think you'll be fine.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
so it's like, this grand opportunity to help out, this struggling kid who knows in his heart that what he's doing is wrong, and also wasn't willing to tell anyone just how like deep it was. It's like I was calling out for help, but I wasn't about to like go to the police station and say like, hey, like I've been like guilty of public indecency as a 12-year-old or whatever. um
Yeah.
the um basically kind of got permission from my direct spiritual leaders, the people most in responsibility of my spiritual health and maturity, kind of just given permission to like,
Yeah.
just keep doing what you're doing. We don't see the problem in it. um
Man.
and even like years later, like college at this point, um I had a girlfriend that I was like, we were kind of pushing that bar, um like moving kind of like closer and closer to having sex without it ever happening. But we were in one of those like close encounters when my like mom unexpectedly gets home, and like semi catches us, and and again, like her response wasn't like this isn't good, this isn't what God designed sex to be, this isn't the beautiful thing that you want it to be. um or it wasn't something chiding and rebuking either. It wasn't like, hey, this isn't godly of you, this isn't like you are partaking in sin. It was neither of those things, which I think both would have been better than what her response was, which was like, if you're gonna have sex, at least use a condom, which is one of the dangerous plagues that I think is wrecking a lot of people right now, which is just treating sex like the only problem with it is the possibility of pregnancy. Um, because like that, pregnancy is the a beautiful thing that can come from sex. Not a danger, not an issue. Um, that like the if anything, like teenagers having sex and getting pregnant would force them theoretically, in an ideal scenario, to actually grow up, stay together, um, get some responsibility, and become adults and become parents. You know, to be having sex and pregnancy never happening, or taking all of the methods that you can to avoid pregnancy, is just allowing immaturity to reign, allowing selfishness to continue, and to be using people and abusing people, um, without ever being held responsible or accountable for um, those immature, immoral tirades. So that was kind of the path that I went on. Um, so I would say, don't want to get too deep into this, but I'm thankful to say that I didn't have um, sex very much before meeting my wife and getting married. Um, that it was basically like 4 brief encounters that were all terrible over the course of like my 20s. Um, so managed to go like 20 years without going all the way, and yeah, there's discourse, especially in the past few years, of like the dangers of purity culture, um, and of thinking of sex as something bad and evil to be ignored. And the idea of like staying pure until marriage, like those are bad and unhealthy, and they hurt a lot of people. But it's like, at the same time, uh, we are currently uh, in the pendulum swing to the opposite side, where there's people are overreacting to the purity culture of the 90s and early 2000s in an equally unhelpful way, that is devaluing sex and kind of like demoralizing sex before marriage, and talking about it like it's not that big of an issue. um and it absolutely still is. And you know I've been married for almost 2 years now, and I'm still dealing with the effects of coming into uh, the marital union with history and experiences that I shouldn't have. So
Right. Right. Man, I just appreciate you being so honest and real with this, because I feel like this is such a needed discussion that this world needs to have. Like you said, the whole concept of sex, I mean, it's starting earlier and earlier now. I mean, and we could both get off into the weeds about, what certain states and politics are doing to kindergartners and training them up, even then. But man, just how real and raw you are. I absolutely know there's someone out there listening to this who needed to hear you be so real and vulnerable, because they're struggling with the same thing. And man, for you, like you said, you're still kind of 2 years into marriage, still kind of dealing with maybe some of the after effects of that. But as far as like the addiction aspect of it, right? At what point did you feel like you were starting to get some relief there, or maybe starting to kind of conquer that battle?
Only seasonally. Like I will tell you the biggest challenge that I have in this area of like finding and enjoying freedom from sexual sin is that I'm always looking to coast. I'm always looking to get to a point where um it's like, okay, I've been good for a while, so I don't need to try anymore. And that's where like it always gets me, whether you blame it on like my flesh or external factors or like the spiritual warfare of the enemy or some mixture of all three. Um, it's always where I get to that point of thinking I've got this now, um, that I end up messing up again. So like I don't have unfortunately some like grand story of like freedom um, to share or boast about. Um, it is an ongoing struggle in some regards. Thankfully, like the worst of it is behind me. There's a lot of growth and sanctification and learning that has happened um, over the years, but at the same time, it's like I think one of the most helpful images that I've ever been shown for what Christianity is that like it's not learning how to become dependent, it's learning how to become increasingly dependent. It's not
That's
walking
good.
with Jesus and letting him hold our hand and carry us along until we're able to walk on our own. It's us leaning increasingly more on him and putting more of our weight, more of our dependence on him, holding his hand tighter, putting more of our weight on him as he carries us the whole way. And that's the thing for me, that like the second I think like I've got it, I'm good enough, I'm strong enough, I'm past this, that's where like failure like comes into my life again. Um which Last Jedi plug, the whole movie is about learning from failure and every character experiencing failure and having to grow from that. Um and on like a level of like God's sovereignty, um every time I'm looking sin in the face, I as like a future possibility, I can say like God is strong enough, God is providing a way out, God does not desire this for me, and like there will be a way to deny that temptation and not give in. But every time I'm looking at sin in the past as something that did happen, that I did cave into, I can also say from that perspective of God's sovereignty that, okay, God allowed that and it happened for a reason, and I can learn from it, grow from it, repent of it, um, and you know, be sanctified to my joy and God's glory through this past sin. And so, holding those two perspectives together, um, I find very helpful. And again, I just like when new temptation occurs, I have to lean into Christ, um, or else like I'll tumble and fall, and maybe not immediately. Like I'm strong enough to make it a little while. I'm strong enough to white knuckle my way through um, a handful of temptations, maybe even a season of temptations. But that's just like a whittling down process until, handing myself over to sin again becomes inevitable, versus that dependence model of leaning more and more into Christ, where, every temptation that is defeated or escaped or fled from on his strength, on his merit, by his spirit, does actually build you up in strength to better be able to handle the next one. And so that's the big thing for me. Like I remember I was attending a Celebrate Recovery group back in 2014, 15, where one of the guys there just broke down crying and saying, like, am I never going to be free from this? Am I never going to be free from this temptation? And he stopped showing up. And I relate so much with that, because like when I pray for God's help, when I pray for God to free me from temptation, from sinful desires, what I'm really praying for and what I'm really wanting is an easy way out. Like, I'm not wanting to wrestle with my sin, to struggle with my sin, to defeat my sin. I'm just wanting the temptation, the desire to no longer be there, so that that sin is just a non-item in my life anymore. And that's not usually how God works. Um, we don't like hearing that, but like, he is in the process of teaching us to rely on him, of testing us and disciplining us in a way that his power is made perfect in our weakness, in a way where we're creating that dependence on him. He is not trying to create independent creatures where his power is made perfect in our power. And that is often, historically what I've been praying for. And I see that in the hearts and prayers of many other people, men and women both, who struggle with this, that they want it just gone, or they want it easy, versus viewing this sin and this temptation as a gift of sorts, as something that can actually push them to rely on God and to live in his grace and love his mercy and experience his strength out of a true need for his strength, because we know how weak we are. And that is a paradigm shift that I have to consistently remind myself about, because again, like, that thing I always go back to is just wanting to coast and wanting it to be easy and wanting to get to a point where, okay, I'm good enough now, I'm holy enough now, I'm sanctified enough now, so all of these efforts that I've made to get to this point, I can stop. And that just isn't the case.
Yeah. Man, that was so beautifully said there, Chase. I mean, that's a sermon right there, honestly. And as you were talking, I thought of what Joe Rojas said on my podcast as he was trying to overcome his drug addiction. He got so overwhelmed at the thought that I have to be drug free the rest of my life. And once he started to realize that, no, I just got to be drug free
Yeah.
today. That was like the big shift for him. And I think that's the same thing with any addiction: pornography, masturbation, alcohol, drugs, cigarettes, whatever, food, whatever it is. I think that's the key. And so I just so appreciate you speaking to that, Chase, and really admire your courage and authenticity in speaking to that. And you're right, just continuing to lean in to God, right? I mean, he's the only hope that any of us have of overcoming whatever struggles and addictions we have. And I loved how you just spoke to that, just increasingly leaning into him. That is a beautiful picture. One last thing, about this time of your life before we start heading forward here, Chase, you said that come high school, you started to realize that, hey, a lot of the stuff that I was being maybe told or taught by my dad, by my parents about faith, theology, really wasn't correct. And so I'm curious, again, being a very formative time of your life, those high school years, how did that affect your faith, your relationship with Christ, and how you viewed God as Father?
Yeah, well, I think if I were to pick, a number one sin struggle throughout my life, it wouldn't be any of the things we've mentioned already. It would be pride. And something a little twisted happened in 11th grade moving forward that was both very good and very bad for my spiritual health and my relationship with God and others, which was me getting deep into theology. It started with reading The Weight of Glory by C.S. Lewis, and then The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Amazing books by amazing men, who've done so much for so many people and did have, positive effects, potentially a net positive with me overall. And I started reading a lot of C.S. Lewis's other work. I think everyone nowadays, especially in like 21st century Western Christianity, goes through a pretty strong C.S. Lewis phase. But yeah, at the same time, it's like the struggle of pride that I had already spent so much of my life and my teenage years especially. But even I can see it in my childhood. This like being built up in the wrong ways and being encouraged in the wrong ways, and that like the sinner in me just found a whole lot of comfort thinking I'm better than you. I'm better than like I know more about the Bible than all these other fourth graders in my Sunday school class. I can like sing and worship better than these other sixth graders in this youth group. And just allowing all of these seeds of self-importance and self-righteousness get planted, and thinking like, as far as 10th graders go, I'm basically as good as like Christians get. And this is like, that's like a dangerously real like thought process that I would have as a high schooler, just putting myself above all of my like Christian peers as like, man, like I've really got this. I'm really good at this whole Christian thing. But again, it wasn't like till like 10th or 11th grade that I started really getting into like the things of God, the study of God, knowing stuff. And granted, I think a very good litmus test to listeners or teenagers out there, seminary students, is like, are you spending all of your time in supplementary materials about the Bible rather than the Bible itself? As I wasn't reading the Bible very much. I was reading C.S. Lewis all the time. And so it's this like this tangential like knowledge of God rather than, to quote another one of these big books, knowing God. Which again, like these guys like J.I. Packer, are trying to get their readers to like know God himself, have a relationship with Jesus Christ, not in like the frilly, frothy, I invited Jesus into my heart, but like he is your, brother, friend, and Lord and Savior. You love him, you fear him, you obey him. All the like, there's so many like relational aspects to like what having a personal relationship with Jesus should mean. And it's so easy to get off course from even like the intentions, those righteous intentions of authors of those books, and it just becoming like, oh, like I know a lot, I can beat you in a debate. And so I had these dual experiences of growing in the faith and learning about the Lord in good ways and learning true things, and being corrected by encountering explorations of scripture and historical arguments and these things that I'd never encountered before, in my kind of just very, very limited upbringing, going to an SBC church that just didn't get deep on anything, and again, like kind of treating my dad as the know-all for answers, only to realize that he was actually coming from a shockingly a specific niche of Christian theology that is weird. Is kind of like a weird mix of Baptist and charismatic with a touch of Molinism. I don't even know what is it like. I'm not sure if he agrees with this, but I'm pretty sure he's an open theist. So again, like it's like having no idea like where my dad fell in the overall pantheon of Christian thought and historical Christian teachings, and not realizing that there was so much breadth to it. beyond just my dad. So it's like these good things are happening, but like this dual thing on the side of it is, excuse me just becoming overly prideful and haughty and thinking of like I'm a good Christian because I can beat you in a debate. And yeah, I think just getting really caught up in intellectualism. And again, if I can have permission to jump ahead a little bit, the I ended up pursuing a seminary degree for one semester, and I had these five guidelines for me to decide after this first semester, would I keep in seminary and pursue a full degree. And the five guidelines for me were like, do I get A's? Can I afford it? Can I make time for it? Am I staying physically healthy? And am I staying spiritually healthy? Well, I got the highest score in my class and, was able to pay for it while still putting money away and made time for all of my homework and papers. Was as healthy as I ever was. But the fifth metric did not get the green light, and was why I quit seminary. Was I spiritually healthy for me? And no, like the fact that I got the highest grade in the class was, like me being super like puffed up and egotistical about getting better grades than everyone else. And my spiritual health was sinking throughout, my time in seminary, and I was able to fool myself that I was okay because I was getting those good grades, because I was learning these things and could recite all of these, like Christianly truths. And once I finished the semester and took time back to reflect, like, oh, this has been very bad for my soul. And I didn't realize it because I was able to rest on the evidence of how good I was doing in my seminary course to think like, I'm okay. I'm being very godly. And so that exiting seminary with all of the time and money that I had set aside to presumably stay in seminary is what actually brought me around to pursuing music instead. That again, like I had like this time and money and just saw an open door. And after years of music kind of being on the sidelines for me, just felt a confident yes from the Lord to pursue music like I never had before. But that concept of the pride and intellectualism is still, an ongoing struggle for me. And just to rope it back to other topics, it's like we never get to coast. It's everything will remain a struggle because the struggle is where we lean on God, rely on God. It's supposed to be His strength showing up increasingly more in us rather than us becoming increasingly strong, so to speak. Or I think that's an accurate way of saying it.
I think of, Paul saying, or I think of Paul talking about the thorn in his side, right? And how with that, exactly like you're saying, man, it causes us to increasingly depend on the Lord. And we talked about it earlier with addiction, but even, with pride, with just kind of personality traits that we need to continue to submit over to the Lord and to be transformed with. I think that's the same logic applies to that. And so again, I just love just how open you are with that. But I guess what really impresses me is just the awareness that you have, the mindfulness that you have to recognize these things about yourself, man. Because I think that's key for all of us, is to be aware of, hey, like what are the things that we need to submit over yet? what's those parts of our hearts that need more of that transformation from God yet. And so that really impresses me, just your overall ability to just be so aware and just kind of take inventory of, okay, yep, this part I'm doing well, but like you said, with those 5 markers, 4 I'm doing great, but that one, yep, I'm not doing well with that. And especially being a young adult at that time, man, again, that just impresses me. And like you said, that kind of through that whole process, that gave you the green light to just go music full time. So again, like I kind of want to go back to the beginning with that. Like, how old were you when you started to develop this skill for music, singing? Maybe what were some of your early influences? Take us back through that.
Sure. To my shame, my earliest experiences songwriting were trying to rewrite other songs. And one of those was Isn't She Lovely by Stevie Wonder,
Oh yeah. Yep.
which is one of the greatest songs of all time. And
Yep.
I, as like a 7-year-old, thought I could do it better.
That
and make
pride
my own
already,
version of
man,
it.
huh?
Woo! It's there from the start. But there were other like This Is the Air I Breathe. That 90s like, vineyard worship song. It was
Yep.
like another one where it's like I wrote my own version of it as a kid. And so like that was like the seedlings of it. And I think those 2 songs actually pretty well represent my earliest influences going into this. I most generally speaking, make rock music now, but I had zero rock growing up, except for rock in the lightest of senses, like Chicago.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, so like this like pop, golden oldies, like, the great hits from, my parents' youth was half of my influence. A lot of standout artists being, like Chicago, Earth, Wind and Fire, Michael Jackson, maybe like early Beatles, Barry Manilow, Frankie Valli, Four Tops, Foundations. So that whole crew of kind of like the intersections of soft rock and soul and R&B, kind of all in that kind of the broad appealing pop of the 60s through 80s. And then the other half was worship and Christian music. So both the music in church and the big radio hits of the 90s. So, for me as, a kid, like the big 4 that I remember as being especially appealing throughout the 90s were DC Talk, Newsboys, Michael W. Smith, and Stephen Curtis Chapman. The only one of those that has super duper stood the test of time for me is Stephen Curtis Chapman. He is still one of my favorite artists to this day. I was a huge Michael W. Smith fan throughout college, but just kind of had like a lyrical falling out with him. And then Stephen Curtis Chapman kind of stepped up to bat and has been holding it down for me ever since. So those 2 categories, were the foundational ones for me throughout my childhood and are still things I love to this day. Like, I have never really been someone who goes through musical phases. It's more just like musical accumulation. Like, I go through phases in as much as like, I listened to a bunch of Weezer over the past few months, but it's never like, oh, that was my emo phase and then my folk phase and then my industrial phase. It's just been like the amount of music that I love and appreciate has just grown and expanded over my life, which I'm very thankful for. Like, I was never like super like loyal to a scene or never like changed like what I wear to match like the music I listen to. It just kind of blew up, which goes into like junior high. I was starting to get into rock music for the first time, and it was a lot of like Tooth and Nail artists, 1,000 Foot Crutch, May, Number One Gun. And so I had a lot of friends at the time, both Christian and not Christian, who were getting into like the solid state stuff and the heavier side of Christian music. And so they were getting into Norma Jean, As Lay Dying, and that. And so like I had that side, and I think there was like a cultural pull for me to just go all in and like this is all I listen to. Like I only listen to Thursday and Poison the Well. But at the same time, I was falling in love with like modern like pop. So like Jesse McCartney and Backstreet Boys. And so that stuff kind of like kept me anchored in a weird way to like, especially like my childhood. Like, I was raised on pop, and was always very like melody and singer centric. And so like, finding those albums as like an eighth grader was like, oh, I don't just have to be the emo guy, the post hardcore guy, the Warped Tour guy, like whatever. I can love all of those artists and then go listen to the new, post hiatus Backstreet Boys album. Or like keep up with like new like R&B releases from Neo and Usher. Like just like allowing that kind of like expanse to have, all the while continuing with like songwriting. So my very first like not writing other people's music but writing my own music actually goes back to 4th grade, so it's probably still 9 years old at this point.
Wow.
I still have a book somewhere and I still remember some of the songs.
That's
Don't
awesome.
ask me to sing them. That I wrote in 4th grade. And they were mostly like pop-ish, worship-y kind of CCM stuff. Like I had a song called Day by Day, I think without realizing that DC Talk already had a song called Day by Day. I had a song called Jesus My Savior, Lord My God. It's like that's the kind of stuff it was. And then as I got more into DC Talk, and then after that, the kind of the rap rock of like Thousand Foot Crutch. Kind of like that started like pushing me in kind of bad directions of like, I'm writing rap music now as a 5th grader. Thankfully that didn't last very long. But yeah, I was very much just like, like would write lyrics and poetry all the time. Would write melodies to them, but didn't have anything to play at that point. And my brother is also into music and was primarily a guitarist. So guitar was the last instrument I wanted to try because I didn't want to be like my brother at all or follow in his footsteps. But in 8th grade, I finally gave guitar a shot, and it clicked. And it was like, oh, this is my instrument. This makes sense to me. Like to this day, it's very strange. But the piano just like is a mystery to me. Like I can write some stuff on the piano. I can play a little bit. But it's like if I write something on the piano, I need to record it that day because I won't remember how to play it if I try to come back to it a week later. And I consistently forget like which key is which. I have to think really hard about like, okay, that's G, that's A. It's all kind of a wash to me. It doesn't click with my brain. Whereas the guitar completely clicks with my brain, and I understand like the theory and the shapes. And so I was able to progress like really quickly as a guitarist once I first picked it up in 8th grade. And so that became like, this foundation to actually write music alongside writing, lyrics and melodies. It was still bad. Don't get me wrong. I was writing very, very low quality material, especially like coming into guitar as already being a songwriter actually kind of like made my writing worse for a little bit because it's like I've been writing songs for years, so I'm just going to do it with the bare minimum that I know on guitar right now. So I was writing these like really embarrassing, like simple things, like with a very small vocabulary of guitar, but just wanting to write, and was even like recording like some of the songs that I was writing like in 8th and 9th grade, even though I had no right to be recording anything at that point. And had, a handful of quote unquote bands during high school, which were just kind of like collection of friends that like we had a moniker over us and maybe would try to get in a garage and play some songs together, but it like never materialized in anything. The only like legitimate band that I had was like a acoustic duo with my friend Trey, which Chase and Trey, and our band name was Chasing Betrayal.
Oh, look at you guys.
Super clever. So he and I actually like played out a good bit. But then he like quit that to join a real band. And then my brother at this point, he and I started becoming friends and started having, after like he and I had a terrible childhood, like in relationship to each other, hated each other always like bickering, got into fights, and again, like I was the goody two shoes, he was the troublemaker, so a lot of like butting heads and such. But once we had some like musical common ground, started becoming friends. At this point, it was like he was 18, I was 13. So when I was in high school, probably 15 at this point, he kind of like invited me into his projects, and I became his kind of like go-to secondhand man and kind of like his projects perpetually. So like would still like write songs on the side, but wasn't really writing for him. Like he very much like had his own vision, and our songwriting styles and stuff were so, again, still like clashing, that he and I didn't try writing together too often. The results were good when we could make it work, but it felt a little bit like Oasis, like just like completely like if we tried writing together too hard, it just totally clashed. So we just needed to let like you have your songs, I have my songs, but my songs were just the back burner thing that no one ever heard. And then for my brother, like I was his guitarist, and then I was his bassist. Eventually, I was his drummer, and this was like over the course of like 10 years and different projects and different kind of styles. So ultimately like he ended up becoming like my best friend basically over the course of this. And we're still very close to this day. He and I moved from Texas to Nashville together, so I still see him all the time and we hang out consistently. He's married with 2 daughters now, and so my wife and I go hang out with his family and help watch his girls every weekend. And still very close and still have desires to play music together. But for a long time, like I was just like extra muscle to help him pursue his music, his dreams. And I was fine with that. Like I didn't really see myself as being like a good enough singer or songwriter to like do my own artistry. Like I again, with my pride issues, there were seasons of times where I thought I was good enough, but then like I would try to make something, show it to people, and realize, oh, I'm not good enough. No one likes this. So it was a very long span of time of me, um, really like behind the scenes, upping my game as a writer, as a singer, as a guitarist, as a drummer, kind of all these things, as just a hobby and just a passion, and the fact that I love it, and the fact that writing songs is something that I just do, and I'm gonna do it no matter what. It's part of how God made me and how I process the world, and just how my brain works. So the songwriting will always be there, whether anyone hears it, outside of my household or not. But I was pretty content for a few years, especially like those years leading up to seminary, where I was super involved in church, and then made that seminary attempt where it was just like songwriting was the thing I did a few times a year, and just played music as a hobby, and sometimes helping out with other bands or playing for other bands, or playing at church, but again, it's like never taking it very seriously or doing like the solo thing until that big switch at the end of seminary, where I felt this door opening and this yes from the Lord to pursue like solo Chase Tremaine music, ostensibly for the first time and in a legitimate sense. Found a producer that I wanted to work with here in the Nashville area. At the time, he was actually on Tooth and Nail Records for his own project called Empty Isles. So worked with him, and at this point, my mentality was very much like, I want to support the music scene here. I want to be a really good fan, and if needed or desired, I can help bands with recording they're like playing their instruments or writing their songs, or be a fill-in guy for shows. But I can record a few songs as like my resume to say like, here's how I sing, here's how I write, here's me playing guitar, bass, and drums. So if you want it, you can have it. And so I recorded 3 songs that would end up being the 3 songs of the 10 on my 2020 debut album, Unfall. And that happened because like I made these 3 songs, we're showing them to people, and alongside like unbelievably supportive and positive feedback that I'd never received for my music before in my life. Just had like the people who know that I'm an album geek, and I always think in terms of albums. I always enjoy music in terms of full albums. Behind me is like a giant vinyl collection,
Oh wow,
most of which is
cool.
covered up by a giant box of CDs. Is um I just got all this encouragement to go back in and to turn that EP into an album. And so it's a lot of like friends and community came around me to help make that happen, and had a successful Kickstarter to get them printed to CDs, and went like all out making like 1,000 of them with like full like 10-page lyric booklet. It was really really cool, really exciting, and really got the whole project off to a really exciting start. Except that I released the album like a few weeks before COVID hit.
Yeah.
So all of my plans to like put a band together to play these songs out live, because I didn't have a band at that point since I played the instruments myself, and plans to still like be like very like supporting in the greater Nashville like rock and punk and emo scenes, and to try to play out with other people and write with other people. All of that came to a screeching halt. So I've really just kind of dug my heels in ever since, the dead live scene of 2020, and just kept my focus on writing and recording.
So I was talking to Zana about that, and her tour for Red for War was about to start, and then I think she had like 3 shows, and then everything shut down, right? And I mean, just talking to a lot of other artists, not everybody made it through the pandemic. As far as continuing their career, a lot of bands broke up, a lot of artists decided to just kind of pull the plug, and like you said, you really put your heels in the ground and said, no, I'm just going to devote to writing and recording. And so then came development and compromise in 2021, correct?
Yeah, and that one happened twice. I don't know if you saw that, depending on how big of a deep dive you did. That album, again, it's like, I could talk to you for hours about The Last Jedi. I could also talk to you for many hours about just this album, because it was a very weird process with a lot of like looking back, questionable decisions about how it all played out, where I basically rushed an album into production, thinking I was just making a B-sides EP, and I booked 5 studio days to record the whole thing, with the idea of like, let's record as much music as possible. Um, so it was supposed to be just the B-sides for all the songs that were in consideration for Unfall, but didn't make the cut. But I had 11 that were kind of in contention. We ended up recording all 11 in just those 5 days. So it was a really cool, exhilarating sprint experience. But then like the mix process was really rushed. The mastering process was really rushed. I didn't really like try enough people or kind of ask around enough. I took an offer to have it mastered for free, with the entire concept of being like, let's see how cheaply I can make an album, which was not the right mentality that I should have gone about it. Not a terrible mentality. I think trying to make the most affordable album, and trying to figure out like how can recording music be as sustainable as possible. That was all good. But it got to a point of me just like rushing and cutting corners, and I ended up putting out an 11-song album that wasn't like really mastered in a way that made it sound as good as it could have. And as exciting as those recording sessions were, and as exhilarating and like edgy and guitar big bad as like it seemed to be in the recording process, that just didn't come across on this album that I again just kind of like rushed out. And so like it didn't have like as exciting of a release, and like the reviews weren't as good, and the word of mouth wasn't as good, and the sustained listening of fans wasn't quite there like it was for Unfall. And I just personally got like really disappointed with how it sounded and how kind of like weak and quiet it was, and how it didn't really lean into like big harmonies and guitar riffs like Unfall had, and just overall, just because I made it in 5 days, it just didn't have like the tender love and care that it was supposed to have. And it was like I decided to release it as my sophomore album, even though I went into the studio thinking I was just making a B-sides EP. So there's this huge disconnect of what it was supposed to be, and then all of a sudden telling the world like, "Hey, this is my sophomore album," and then being like, "Oh, this kind of sophomore slumped, didn't it?"
Sure.
So I talked to the producer that I recorded it with, and he agreed to let me come back to the studio to re-record a bunch of it, as well as to record a few new songs. So the original version released January 2021. The final version released November 21, so 10 months later, with 4 new songs recorded for it, and almost every song having aspects that were re-recorded or added to it. So like recorded new harmonies, added a bunch of new guitar riffs, had some guest musicians come on. So like some songs got piano treatment, 2 of them got horn treatment. And it really just became a whole new album. Like it wasn't like the same 11 songs plus 4 bonus tracks. It was all like reimagined, rethought out. Like some of the songs that have guest features are literally longer now because they became different, fuller songs with new things that were written. Um, and I'm really proud of a lot of those new versions and love what we did. And I love how more collaborative it was than the first time through. That again, like the first time through was just me in the studio for 5 days. And so very kind of like, it was a very like chase focused thing. And the new version became way more like communal and yeah, just like I said, collaborative. So I'm very proud of the way the second one came out, but just logistically and like the rollout was bad. The so much about the timing of it, and like it would have been really cool if that was the album I made the first time around. And I just became like, I went from being really just like rushed with the mixing and mastering process to being way too picky and notes giving and um just very in my head about it. So it's just like the the original version was like me making the cheapest album possible, and then the final version became my most expensive album of them all. So it was just there's so much in that I am actually like considering writing a little like a short book of like what not to do, the story of
Yeah.
development and compromise. Um,
Right.
but it's a cool album, and I love the songs on it, and it's also very long. It's 15 tracks, almost an hour, compared to Unfall and the new album Accidental Days, both being just 10 and closer to like 40 minutes. But yeah.
Sounds like a lot of good learning lessons from development and compromise
Yeah,
that you were
every
able
album
to.
has had lots of learning experiences.
Yeah,
Always
that
always lessons learned.
that you were able to apply to. Yeah, here we are now with Accidental Days. And I was telling you before we hit record that I've had this on repeat. It's such a, for me, it's such an easy listen. Like the songs, the mood for them, and it comes in at 37 minutes. It's just a really easy listen. And each track, man, like I just love the sound. And as I said, you have such an eclectic sound. Some songs are very like folk, feeling. Others you got like an alt rock feel. And man, what was cool about this is, again, as I was doing research, is that a lot of these songs are, if not all these songs, these were written in like 2012 or like long before some of these other albums that you've had come out. Is that correct?
Yeah. So in I guess in actuality, the all 3 of these albums, um, the grand bulk of them range from 2010 to 2019. So it's very much like these 3 albums are clearing me out of the best of the songs that I wrote from that whole decade. But like I also became increasingly prolific as that decade went on. So it's like There are some songs from like 2010, 2012, but mostly songs from like 2019. So it's not a very even spread across that decade, but there's definitely some old ones. And the songs on Accidental Days like really, really went through the ringer. Again, like none of these songs are from this decade. They're 2012 to 2019. And 2012 was a really crazy, beautiful summer for me, where I was a summer missionary, like a college student missionary at the Grand Canyon. And so I lived at the Grand Canyon for a summer, and it was very formative and challenging, and also like the very first like prolific songwriting season I ever had. I wrote basically an album's worth of songs while I was there, and spent years wanting to record that album. And it's like the spirit and the ethos of that album eventually became Accidental Days, and like 2.5 of those Grand Canyon songs made it onto Accidental Days. But it's just like it became all these other things over the years of like this kind of acoustic guitar based songs about the intersections of faith, life, friendship, heartbreak, and aging. Kind of like that very much ties in with what the Grand Canyon album was in 2012, and just morphed into a whole new thing exactly a decade later when I recorded the album, and in the summer of 2022.
That's amazing, man. That's amazing. And yeah, I mean, I got the list of songs in front of me here. Tired Side of Content, love that one. I think probably my favorite one is Settled in the Unsettled. I just love the message there. I love the feel for it. I mean, I just picture myself sitting at a campfire and like you just kind of strumming on your guitar, playing that as we're singing it around the campfire. I love the vibe, man. And I mean, all these songs, Choose, Distracted. I love that the opening riff and that piano together there. It sounds awesome. And I mean, you've mentioned it. You play all the instruments on here, aside from a few guest appearances, such as the horn player on New Creation Grey. And again, that one, man, that's got a really amazing message. Can you tell us a little bit more about New Creation Grey in specific?
Yeah, would be happy to. And huge shout out to the guest players on my albums. Theo McMillan is like my secret weapon. He before I record any of my albums, like I sit down with him, I play him all the songs and get like his feedback on them. And sometimes he has ideas, sometimes it's just like kind of saying like, I think this could be better, or just him saying like, yeah, that's a great song, good job. And then Brendan Dorman is the trumpet player on New Creation Grey, and he's been on all of my albums so far. And New Creation Grey just started to stick out as like, oh, this is the one that is really asking for the trumpets, especially like at the end for the very last like few seconds of the song. I wrote this really fun bass lick. It's like I was like, what if the trumpets also play what the bass guitar is doing? And it just worked out better than I could have imagined, and I'm so pleased with that one musically. But I think I'm even more pleased with it lyrically. That I just really feel like that song, more than the usual song, was just like a gift to me from the Lord, just of like him teaching me something and showing me something that I needed for my own encouragement, and it just immediately turning into a song. That one is 2017 or 18, where I was just like, it was like the first time in my life where I was really like coping with aging. Like I'd come out of a very healthy season and was kind of like losing that, and was like gaining weight again, and like had my like first gray hairs showing up, and just like having like irregular like back problems, and I have a chronic knee issue. And like the knee issue like regularly puts me on crutches, and it makes me feel like I'm due to end up in a wheelchair eventually. So all these things that I'm like wrestling with, and just not having like a lot of like, I guess, like respect for aging, because I'm more thinking of like getting older as like this bad thing where I'm just like losing, ability and losing quality of life.
Yeah.
Then at the same time, like not having like proper weight and respect and desire for the new creation bodies that are promised to us in scripture, which in itself might be a head scratcher to a lot of listeners, because that's one of those uh biblical topics that just isn't taught very well.
Yeah.
And what's crazy is when Paul brings it up in First Corinthians and talks about like not just the resurrection of Christ, but the resurrection of all things, and the fact that we will be like, you know, raised in immortal bodies. Like that, he says that like if this isn't true, then I'm a fool. Like, if this isn't true, then Christianity is not worth its time. So he positions it as like one of like the hills to die on
Yeah.
for Christianity being worth, us giving any of our time and care to in this life. It was like, if I'm not living again after I die, then I might as well just like throw all my cares away and spend this life just being as luxurious and uh, immediately gratifying as possible.
Right.
But if there is a life to come, then I should spend this life preparing for that one, because this is just a speck of dust in comparison to eternity. Uh, and yet somehow, like, we've raised a generation of people that thinks that people turn to angels when they die,
Yeah.
or that we're just going to have some like soul existence for eternity, that we're just going to be like little ghosts in church pews singing worship songs in an eternal church service, rather than like living in a perfected version of earth with perfected versions of our bodies unbroken by sin. um and so like loving that truth, loving that promise, believing that promise, is basically what the choruses of the songs are about. So it's kind of like a three-part thing. It's like the verses are me dealing with me aging. The choruses are me like learning to remember and cherish the promises that we have in Christ, that he is just the first fruits of the of the resurrection. And then the bridge kind of ties those together with this, not a statement of like this is true or this is what I believe, but rather just positing a theory that of all the things that we don't know about what the resurrection will be like and what the new heavens and new earth will be like, what if we're actually all old, but it's not, you know, it is a perfected version of being 50 or 60, where you are in a perfected version of your body. So like there's no cancer, there's no broken bones, there's no weakness, there's no back pains, there's no posture issues, like, but you know you are older and dignified and you have gray hair, and we all have gray hair. And you know maybe if you died at age 80, you'll still be age 80 permanently, but the perfect version of it. And if you like died as a baby or before you even born, you'll also be 80 and it'll be great. And if you died as a teenager, like you'll be 80. And like that is theoretically possible. I believe that there's room in scripture for that to theoretically be the case. Again, I'm not saying that it is, but the fact that it could be is just a thought experiment that I'm bringing up in the bridge of the song to say, like, isn't that beautiful? And
Mm.
how much more beautiful does age and growing older look when you can see it through the light of the new creation that is coming for us? And so it was like challenging myself that once I was properly trained in this teaching, again, like getting away from the thoughts of a kid of like, oh, we just become bodiless spirits when we die, and we float around and whatever, and we'll just be in the spirit realm of heaven, whatever that means, whatever that looks like. Once I understood the the biblical teachings of the new creation, my assumption is that we were all going to be like permanent 21-year-olds, because I'm thinking of it in terms of like the peak version of what I know now. But it's like, as someone now in my 30s, that just gives me reason to like look back and idolize, like, oh man, to be 21 again.
Yeah.
And so I think New Creation Grey just challenges that and really dignifies growing older in light of all of that. And for me, like, it's just like it culminates in this kind of like dance party. It's kind of like old fashions, like dance party at the end that kind of sounds like it comes from like the 70s pop music that I mentioned earlier that I
Yeah.
grew up on.
Yep.
In a way that just really I think matches the themes really well and just provides a really nice ending to the song and the album as a whole in a celebratory fashion. That also kind of very intentionally mirrors how Unfall ended. Because there's a lot of ways in which these three albums kind of connect and mirror each other in fun ways that I've enjoyed. Kind of
Yeah.
making them
Yeah.
a very loose trilogy of albums.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I like how you said that. Like it just that last part of New Creation Grey just seems to really tie everything together, bringing this album to a close. And I highly recommend everybody listening to this go out of your way to listen to this. Chase, where can people find Accidental Days?
It is streaming everywhere. Spotify, Apple, Amazon. If anyone uses Deezer, but on Bandcamp, chasetremaine.bandcamp.com. You can not only stream it, but you can also download it for free or buy it at a pay whatever you want price model. And then I also just got CDs in stock this month, so those will be up for sale very soon on the Bandcamp store.
Awesome. Go check it out. I'll put all the links to that in the show notes. Chase, you've been super gracious with your time, man. I've really enjoyed this chat with you. Last question for you, man. As you look back at the goodness of God in your life through everything that we've talked about, what stands out to you?
Yeah, that that question is a great lead in to a story that I wanted to tell earlier and that we just didn't really have a chance to fit in.
Sure.
Which, for anyone listening, which by the way, thank you. You just spent, over an hour almost, perhaps almost 2 hours at this point, depending on how the episode gets edited down, hearing from a total stranger. And I hope that it's been useful and uplifting and encouraging, perhaps even rebuking, but hopefully towards the point of, being sanctified and edified. And, I toward the very start of this episode, I mentioned that I was probably going to throw my parents under the bus a little bit, talking about my childhood and teenage years. But the craziest thing that is like a miracle of God's unbelievable kindness is that my parents are actually back together.
Whoa, what?
Mm-hmm. After 15 years of being divorced.
Wow.
They and I mentioned that my brother and I attempted to kind of parent trap them a bit, but that never worked. and my dad and I actually had a bit of a falling out at one point of just really, really, really not seeing eye to eye on just his life and where he was at and choices he was making. And yeah, it just caused like a season of for us to just kind of like we weren't talking as much, and when we did, it was super shallow. This is back in 2018, I want to say, and little did I know, kind of when I backed out and just wasn't really involved in my dad's life anymore, and was like, you know what, I'm done with this. I'm tired of like dealing with your stuff and trying to help you and all this. I'm gonna live my own life. You live yours. We don't see eye to eye on things anymore. It was during that season where God worked just miracles in my parents' life, and they started meeting up because my brother was getting married. I'll try to tell the short story of this. I'll try not to get into the weeds of the details, but my parents started meeting up specifically to talk about my brother's upcoming marriage, just like travel plans, what they could do to help, what they could do to plan and all that. And there was just like one moment over dinner where like my dad says he felt the Lord just like flicking a switch in his brain saying like, I love you, and kind of like fell in love with my mom in a way that he never actually had before, and allowed him to like pursue reconciliation and to be a more active pursuer of romance than he ever actually had in their marriage beforehand, and just completely like restored their marriage and like restored my mom's trust in him. And there was a lot of work that needed to be done in her life too, but um yeah, it was the night before my brother's wedding, after like they had secretly kind of been meeting and kind of getting to re-know each other and redate each other in private without like my brother and I knowing at all. It was the night before his wedding at the rehearsal dinner where he came up to me and was like, "Son, I have something I need to tell you." And then he just grabbed my mom and smooched her. I was like, "What?" And I was like, "What is happening right now?" And then he told me that like this has been like kind of like in the works for like the preceding 6 months. And it's like,
Wow.
after all the times that my brother and I had tried to like contrive it and parent trap them together, like almost so that we could take zero credit for it, the Lord did it once we were totally backed off, hands off, not involved at all. Um, and yeah, like 2 months later, they got engaged. My dad bought a brand new ring. Um, and then a few months later, they were officially remarried. And now they moved here from Texas to Tennessee to be kind of present, active grandparents for my brother's daughters. And they actually enjoy spending time together and have become generally inseparable in a way that is the opposite of like the absent father that I had growing up. Um, and it's just unbelievable to say like, yeah, there's a perspective from which I can fairly say that like my dad like messed up my childhood by giving me a very poor example of what God the Father is like and what a good godly father on earth is supposed to be like. But now I get the pleasure of seeing my actual father being a godly father and being godlike and being selfless and caring and pursuing relationship and reconciliation. And so I get to see, to answer your question specifically, I get to see the goodness of God, and probably the last place I expected to see it.
Oh my goodness, man. That is. Oh, I got chills just listening to you say that. I mean, that is, I mean, that's just the goodness of God, right? That's reconciliation, that's restoration. When God restores something, he makes it better than what it ever was before.
Exactly.
And if that isn't an example of that, I don't know what is. Chase, man, I've really enjoyed this conversation, really enjoyed getting to know you. How can people keep up with you? Where can they follow you?
Sure. Probably too many places. I regularly consider like getting rid of my Facebook and Instagram, but they're there. Most things are at Chase Tremaine, Tremaine, including chasetremaine.com. And if you go to the website or to facebook.com/Chase Tremaine Music, there is a sign up for my monthly newsletter, which is a really cool way to keep up with things. If like that's where like news always goes there first. Music premieres, that's kind of like everything there is first and personal, and you can literally just respond to that email to chat with me. But then I'm also like I'm fairly active on Twitter. Granted, it's a lot of like Last Jedi debates, but if you want to get into it, Twitter's the place.
That's the place for it. And so, yeah, I'll put all the links to that in the show notes again. Chase, again, thank you for being so gracious. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for using your gifts to uplift and encourage people and to point people towards Jesus. And man, just keep doing what you're doing, man. I'm a fan.
Thank you, Terry, and you as well. I know this podcast is great, and you've been a delight. And it's also just like so special to be in this album rollout and kind of deal with a lot of the same questions over and over again from a lot of the same, or from different websites. Which I'm thankful to any opportunity that I've had to interview for any website, but sometimes it's like I ask questions that's like I should just copy and paste what I wrote for the same question for the last one, and then here to be able to share, so much more than like anyone else would ask me, and to get really real and personal and Christ focused with this, which is what I want to happen, with this album. I don't want it to distract us from what matters. I want it to help us plug in deeper to what matters. So you've given us a great outlet for doing that, and I'm very grateful for it.
Well, it's been my pleasure, man. Let's stay in touch.
Absolutely.